I'm Andrew Rutledge, Bentley historian and research associate. And I'm very pleased to welcome you all tonight to the Detroit Observatory, a division of the Bentley. And I also want to welcome our online audience watching us on YouTube. Thank you for joining us both virtually and in person on a pretty chilly evening here in late February. But tonight, we have a really exciting talk here in the second oldest building on Michigan's campus about what many claim is its most beautiful, the Michigan Law Quadrangle. Instantly recognizable in photographs and a mainstay of campus tours, the Law Quad's Tudor Gothic architecture transports visitors to a very different world from the rest of campus. It is undoubtedly iconic, and walking through it, one can very easily believe the campus rumor that it was a finalist to represent Hogwarts in the Harry Potter movies. But the Law Quad is much more than just a set of beautiful buildings. It's also a symbol of a transformation in the way legal education and research was structured in the United States, a transformation that Michigan was at the forefront of. But Michigan's law school was founded in 1859. By 1870, was already the largest in the entire country. But not surprisingly, it was such a thing, which was its size. By the early 20th century, it had far outgrown its three-story building on Central Campus where Haven Hall now stands. Enter William W. Cook, Michigan law graduate of 1882, and Cook believed that lawyers were the key to preserving America's institutions for the future, both legally and intellectually. And since lawyers were shaped by their educations, in his view, law schools were the custodians of America's future. And he was determined to make Michigan one of the greatest law schools in the land. And the story of how Cook, described as, quote, a strange composite of the urbane and the tyrannical, the generous and the suspicious, the dreamer and the dictator, an array of U of M regents, presidents, deans, faculty, and students, made the Law Quadrangle a beautiful reality, is the subject of our talk this evening. Here to share the story of William W. Cook's determination to succeed in giving it all away is Margaret Leary. She is librarian emerita of the University of Michigan Law School, having served as its director for nearly 3 decades, from 1984 to 2011. A longtime member of the Ann Arbor District Library Board, she also writes about local issues for the Ann Arbor Observer and is an invaluable researcher and volunteer on the Bentley Historical Library's African American Student Project. Long interest in the history of the law school, Margaret has written a really wonderful book, also titled Giving It All Away, about the story of the Law Quad and William Cook, which is available both in paperback and on e-readers. I highly recommend it. It's a fantastic book. But more than being a great writer, I can testify that she has a gift for storytelling and a deep knowledge of and passion for the history of the University of Michigan. Please join me in welcoming Margaret Leary.
Thank you very much. Am I audible? Thank you. I am thrilled to be here, and I'm thrilled to have another chance to talk about William W. Cook. I, at one point, was very obsessed with William W. Cook, and I guess I still am. My obsession began back in August of 1973 when I began the job of being assistant director at the U of M Law Library. Because it was August, hardly anybody else was around. There were no faculty, there were no students. It's a great big library, but I had it all to myself to explore. And I decided to start with a large walk-in vault that had housed the library's rare book room until the rare book collection got too big for that vault. So when I came to look in the vault, it contained unspecified valuables, including the hundreds of dollars in coins from the coin-operated copy machines, which you all probably don't ever know existed, but it was pretty important. It was a lot of money. So I look around, and I found a plain cardboard box, no marking on it. It was heavy, and it was about this big, and I wondered, what could it be? It was so heavy, and this was a room for valuable stuff. I thought it might be gold. So I had to open it up. And I opened it up, took out the tissue paper, and lifted out a large black head. Now, what could this be? Who or what was it? It looked vaguely familiar, and then I remembered the bust in the east end of the reading room in the Legal Research Building. There's another one just like it in the Martha Cook Building. What I had found was a model for that bust. It had been made from Cook's death mask. Cook had stubbornly refused to have any photo taken since around 1900. And of course, he died in 1930. And I will show you the photo that was taken around 1900. But when he died, people wanted his bust, and so they used a death mask to create the bust. And what I had found was that death mask. So that's what I had discovered there. And that got me to thinking, once again, about some other things that seemed like mysteries. There was a bigger mystery than what was in that box, and it had to do with the Legal Research Building, which you see on this slide. The Legal Research Building and the entire Law Quadrangle, 4 buildings. You can recognize it here. At the back left is the Martha Cook Building, across Tappan Street from the John Cook Dormitory, his parents, named after his parents. So all of this was named after Cook, and I was new to Ann Arbor, new to Michigan, so of course I had to find out who he was. So I asked my faculty colleagues, especially the older ones. No one knew very much about William Cook. They didn't know why anything except that he was a Michigan law grad who had been a corporate lawyer in New York and made a lot of money. But they didn't know how he made the money. They didn't know who he worked for. They didn't know why he gave so much money to the University of Michigan. And a few warned me, and now you're going to hear the same words that he told you, that he was peculiar and prejudiced. And the secretary of the university, who knew Cook well, put it this way: he was outstandingly philanthropic in his own way, a strange composite of the urbane and the tyrannical, the generous and the suspicious, the dreamer and the dictator in practical matters. What is on this slide is another, less well-known building, also done by York and Sawyer, who were the architects of the Law Quadrangle and the architects of Martha Cook. This is the Chi Psi fraternity across the street from Hutchins Hall, and this was built in 1915, the same time that Martha Cook was done. And I will get back to talking about this building, which has another connection to Cook later. This is right across State Street from Hutchins Hall. It was designed by York and Sawyer and originally for an individual, but it was soon purchased by Chi Psi, the fraternity that still owns it. Okay, when I had asked about Cook, people warned me about one of his books. And this is a picture of the second edition, American Institutions and Their Preservation, which they said was proof of Cook's prejudices and therefore was hidden away from library users in a locked cage. This is in 1973, locked away from users. So more about this book later. My urge to find out more about Cook back in '73 was quickly set aside for the 8-year process of creating the fabulous underground law library edition, and then by 20 years of library management, teaching in the law and library schools, and participating in professional organizations. When I did begin the Cook research, Deans Jeff Lehman and then Evan Kamenker encouraged me and let me take time off to do the research, which took me many different places. The result was my book, Giving It All Away. My research led me to a number of really interesting things. First of all, a terrific story. Romance, broken hearts, emotion, drama, the clashing wills of men at Michigan, suspense, and several lawsuits. Secondly, I wanted to find out Cook's motivation to give it all away to the Michigan Law School. Third, I found the roots of the U of M's early and strong support from alumni ahead of all other public universities. And that's one of the main points that I want to make in this talk, is that it was way back at the beginning of the 20th century when Cook and Hutchins primarily realized that that would have to be done. The fourth thing is that Cook never saw a single stone of what he built in Michigan. from the 1915 Martha Cook Building to the 1933 completion of the Law Quad. He never saw any of it. He never came back to Ann Arbor after he graduated from law school in 1882. My research led me to many fascinating people and places I would never otherwise have found. Today, I want to focus not just on the Law Quad, but also on the women in Cook's life and how the Martha Cook Building, Cook's first gift, led to his others. The Law Quad story is too long and complex to tell completely, but I'll do it lightly. I want to start with Cook's death and a lawsuit that threatened to take half of Cook's estate away from the law school. Could the Quad have been twice as big as it is? Let's go back to June 3rd, 1930, a day so hot that people were collapsing on the streets of New York City and dying from the heat. In a worn-down house on 97 gorgeously landscaped acres in Port Chester, New York, about a 20-minute train ride from Manhattan, William Cook lay on a metal bed that had been placed on a worn rug in his living room. He was struggling to breathe, his lungs weak from a decade of tuberculosis. He was deeply depressed. His only solace then was knowing that his fortune, then about $12 million, and I'm only going to say the dollars as they were then, otherwise I'd have to translate it every time I gave the talk, acquired through hard work as a lawyer, as a writer, and as a shrewd investor. That money would be spent, he knew, as he was dying, on what he most valued, the preservation of American institutions, specifically the legal system and democracy. Specifically the legal system and democracy by improving the education of lawyers. He was certain that his will ensured that everything would go to the Michigan Law School. The next day, June 4th, 1930, as a broiling sun brought New York to its knees on the hottest day of the year, Cook breathed his last. The next week, the New York Times reported on Cook's will, quoting the university officials who said the gift would make the law school, quote, the wealthiest the world has ever known. Unfortunately, an exaggeration. I can well imagine the reaction to Cook's death in Ann Arbor that June. Genuine grief at Cook's death, but also a huge feeling of relief. For years before his death, university administrators had worried that Cook might not, as everyone hoped, give everything to Michigan. They feared that his sour relationship with Law Dean Henry Bates, shown here, would drive Cook away and ruin everything for Michigan. Cook's death and the news of his will had eliminated these concerns, they thought. I can also imagine the scene in Ann Arbor 8 months later, early 1931, when Dean Bates learned about the latest development in the much-anticipated Cook legacy. A woman who claimed to be Cook's wife was threatening to sue for half of his estate. Cook's wife? Bates would have raged, pulling off his rimless glasses and pushing aside his brown hair. He was prickly, prejudiced, peculiar, and stubborn. It's hard to imagine he had a friend, let alone a wife. Where did she come from? This must be a fraud. Before I disclose the outcome of the will contest, I want to give you context, starting with the highlights of Cook's life. William Cook was born in Hillsdale, Michigan in 1858. His father, John P. Cook, was a founder of the town of Hillsdale and a successful businessman, banker, and lumber mill operator. He was active in Michigan politics, was in the legislature, and was a participant in the 1850 State Constitutional Convention. And this picture of Cook is the only one that I found. This is him in about 1900, and there is nothing after that, no photos after that I could find, and I really looked. Will was the fourth child of John Cook and his second wife, Martha. His first wife, who was Martha's sister, had died but left 3 children. And what was typical back then was if one if a woman died leaving children, the husband would go back to where he got his first wife to find his second wife. And John Cook married, as his second wife, Martha Cook, the one that the Martha Cook building is named after. So Will grew up in this large family. And I don't know whether they were his cousins or his half-siblings or what. This is his house in Hillsdale. It's still there. I visited it one Sunday morning. It's a fraternity now. And my husband took me, and I said, okay, I'm getting out. He says, where are you going? I said, I'm going into the house. He said, you can't do that. I said, well, if the door's unlocked, I can. So I went in because it was Sunday morning, it was a fraternity. Who would be awake? It's 10 o'clock, right? Nobody was awake. So I went in and I looked around, and it was quite nice. At any rate, the local paper often wrote of parties that were held at the Cook home by Walt Cook's parents, describing them as elegant, gracious, and generous, and referring to John and Martha in the most respectful tones. John Cook gave land and money to Hillsdale College, and Will's first philanthropy was to Hillsdale, first for a new boiler, and then to refurbish a women's dorm, and finally, and most generously, to found a department of domestic science. And this is a wonderful portrait of Martha Cook, Will Cook's mother. This is from the Martha Cook building. Many of you may have been in that building, and this is the portrait of her that is there. In Cook's philanthropy, it was clear that Martha was foremost in his mind. She created a loving home for her family, he created homes first for women at Hillsdale and then at Martha Cook, named for his mother, and later for the mostly male law students in the law quad. This is what the law building looked like when it began. This is it in 1882. This is about when Cook earned his LLB. He earned a bachelor's degree here in 1880, and then the law degree, and this is what the law building looked like. This building is long gone, but it was used until 1930, or even after that, 1933, when all of the law quad was finished. This is what the library in that first law building looked like, and this is what people who were working, teaching in the law school or going to school there used as their library until 1933, when the Legal Research Building finally opened. This is what it looked like when it was expanded in the 19-teens. And Cook, almost immediately after graduating, moved to New York City, where he clerked for 2 years with Frederick Coudert, a name that may not be familiar now, but Frederick Coudert was the founder of the first great international law firm, Coudert Brothers, and Cook worked there. He then entered into practice with 2 other lawyers with whom he worked for 10 years. Meantime, he joined the prestigious Kane Masonic Lodge, and this is a photo of the interior of the building that lodge uses now. It had many influential Manhattanites, many. He would have met many important people there. Cook's father died in 1884, leaving Cook the resources to do exactly what he wanted to do. In 1895, he took a big career step. He left his practice to become general counsel to John Mackey's companies, the most important of which were the Postal Telegraph, shown here, and the commercial cable. This is the Postal Telegraph building, and this is the commercial cable building, a very tall building for its time. This, of course, doesn't mean much unless I tell you who John Mackey was and what his company did. To understand the next 25 years of Cook's life and his fortune, we have to know about John Mackey. He was born in Ireland in 1831. He went to California, and then he went to Nevada in the 1850s. He accumulated a huge fortune as one of the richest of the Silver Kings. He retired to New York City in 1882, the same year Cook arrived, and went right back into business, but of a new sort. not silver mining. There's not that much in Manhattan, not in the ground anyway. Mackey, whose wife lived in Europe, was greatly offended by the low quality and high cost of communicating overseas to his wife. He knew that this was due to the telegraph and cable monopoly held by Jay Gould's Western Union. By 1886, Mackey had broken Western Union's monopoly. And this is the Postal Telegraph and Cable Company. Telegraph, right, across the land using wires. Cable, underwater. Okay, so two different things. Over the next 30 years, the Mackey companies were the only real competition to Western Union. Cook was crucial to the Mackey company's continuing success in challenging the Western Union monopoly and maintaining competition that ensured lower rates and better service. And here's what they did. On July 4th, 1903, in this slide, you can see President Teddy Roosevelt and Mackey came together at TR's Oyster Bay Retreat on Long Island, where they exchanged eastbound and westbound telegrams and cables that circled the globe in 9 minutes and 12 minutes, respectively. In short, Cook helped to create the first global communication network. And I will tell you a little bit about how he did that. Cook's major contribution to that network was his expertise in corporation law. There was and is no national corporation law. Instead, each state wrote, and still does, its own corporation law. The Mackey companies had to establish a presence in literally every state in order to run telegraph lines through those states and to have businesses there, as they did here in Ann Arbor, to get customers. This required Cook to learn the law of every state and eventually Canada and apply it. This is the Postal Telegram office in Ann Arbor in 1890. It was at the corner of East Huron and North 4th. And I don't think that building is still there, but this is what it looked like. And this is what it looked like inside where their operators were. This was in a building called the Cornwell Building at East Huron and North 4th. It looked like this inside in the mid-1890s. So Cook's contributions to corporation law were really, really important. As important as he became as a corporate lawyer, he was even more influential as a scholar and leading writer on corporation law. His book, Cook on Corporations, was the major treatise meaning a book describing what the law is and the cases and statutes underlying that law. It was the very first one on this core topic from its first edition in 1887, when Cook was only 5 years out of law school, to the last 8th edition, which was 6 volumes in 1923. And what Cook did was to move the focus of corporation law in 2 ways. First, he pioneered the use of the corporation as the legal entity for the emerging large businesses of the Industrial Revolution. Previously, the corporation had been used almost exclusively for nonprofits such as churches. So the first thing he did was to make it something that corporations would want to use, not just churches or other nonprofits. Secondly, he moved the focus from the rights of the corporation as a legal entity to the rights of the stockholders who owned the stock in those corporations. Together, these 2 steps set the pattern for the development of modern corporate law. Cook's writings on corporation law are probably the most authoritative sources of information on its development from 1887 to 1927. Another of his first books, Trusts, written in 1887, yes, he wrote 2 books, the 5th year after his graduation from Michigan Law, provided the Ohio Attorney General, shown on this slide, with crucial information, the actual text of the Standard Oil Trust Agreement. This led to the first suits against the Standard Oil Trust, the suit that was won by the Ohio Attorney General, and his reward was Standard Oil left Cleveland and went to New York. Cook wrote 14 books, many articles, and some draft legislation about railroad organization. Okay, I'm going to pause now and go to a whole different aspect of Cook's life. Enough for the law and the books and all that. Let's look at something more fun. If we're going to understand his legacy to the law school, we need to know that he filled his personal life with fine architecture and landscaping, as he later did at the U of M. York and Sawyer, the architects of the Martha Cook Building, and then the Law Quadrangle, and the fraternity house I showed you across State Street from Hutchins Hall, York and Sawyer designed Cook's Manhattan townhouse, which I'm showing you here. It was built in 1913 on East 71st Street. Now, if you're not familiar with this neighborhood, it was originally a really good place to live, and then it declined quite a bit, but recently it's had a new life. So this is one building from the Frick house. Here you see Cook's, the top floor of Cook's townhouse, and to the right is a little bit of the Frick library. From the inside of the Frick house, which is around the corner from the library, you can look out and see the backyard of where Cook lived. And I did that. Cook was gone. This older photo shows all 4 of the above ground floors. You can see it was narrow, but very tall and pretty elegant. Cook retired in 1920 when he learned he had tuberculosis. And you can imagine people smoking a lot of cigars, no air conditioning, very few windows, because you can see there's buildings on both sides of this, and people in there smoking, it might make you kind of sick. I don't know, but he got tuberculosis. On doctor's orders, he then lived mostly in the better air of Portchester, where he lived in an older house on a very large property. It was 97 acres. He is said to have spent $50,000 a year on landscaping at Portchester. He died there in 1930. And now for the story of the Martha Cook Building, Cook's first gift to the U of M. By 1910, women at Michigan were agitating to get a dormitory. There were no dormitories at the University of Michigan until a couple years after 1910. Everyone, all students then, lived in boarding or rooming houses, and that was a special difficulty for women students. For one thing, back then and for a long time, Michigan had far, far more men students than it did women. So it was scary to send a daughter to such a place, and mothers even accompanied their daughters here and lived with them. The university didn't yet have a system of dormitories, and in fact, President Angel, who served from 1871 to 1909, and his predecessors had not wanted dormitories. They feared resentment from the many townies who made a living boarding students, and they didn't want to undertake new expenses. Think about it. It was a relatively new university, growing, and they had to build classrooms, they had to build laboratories, they had to build a hospital, they had to have libraries, and then they had to fill those places with books and equipment and faculty that they were paying. So they had to hire and retain faculty. But the women were insistent, especially one, Myrtle White, who is in the lower right corner of this photograph. Remember that name, Myrtle White? You will see her and hear about her again. The women were insistent, especially Myrtle, who in 1910, the summer before her senior year, traveled around Michigan trying to raise awareness of the need for a dorm for women and the money to build it. This was in the days long before a development office, long before the university had hundreds of staff to raise money and to build buildings. Myrtle graduated, but the regents, and especially then President Hutchins, who had been dean of the law school, had succeeded Angel as U of M president. In 1910, were so impressed by her that they sent her in January 1911 to call on successful alums in New York City. And one of the most successful was William Cook. This Cook's office was at 44 Wall Street, which was and is the financial district's ultimate location. Young Myrtle White called on Cook in his office at 44 Wall Street on January 15, 1911. She was armed with a set of plans from a Detroit architect. York and Sawyer were in New York. For a women's dorm, she impressed Cook, who asked many questions. 4 years of living in boarding houses had prepared her with the facts about the advantages dorms would have. Cook said he would support her project and asked Miss White to have your president call on me. President Hutchins, shown here, did call on Cook, who later pledged $10,000 to the dorm project. The fundraising continued. About a year later, Cook, remember, he had been giving annually to Hillsdale, to the domestic science department, got a letter from Hillsdale College asking him to give money for a women's dorm at Hillsdale and suggested that he do that and they would name the new building after his mother, Martha. Martha had died only 18 months earlier in 1909. Cook's response must have deeply disappointed the people at Hillsdale. He could not give money for a dorm, especially as the president of the University of Michigan has called upon me to build a similar building at Ann Arbor at an expense of $150,000. His original pledge of $10,000 had grown. No more Cook money would ever go to Hillsdale. It was hard to give this talk in Hillsdale. Hillsdale's request inspired Cook in two ways. First, he enjoyed boasting that the president of the University of Michigan had come to Cook's Wall Street office to ask for money. Second, he got the idea of naming the dorm after his mother. This may explain how Cook's gift, initially just $10,000, expanded by 1913 to cover the entire $400,000 that Martha Cook cost. The building and all of its interior furnishings, everything was paid for by Cook. By the way, in the entire $400,000. So Martha Cook ended up costing $400,000 and Cook paid for all of it. That same year, Hill Auditorium opened, and that cost $300,000, not $400,000. This shows Portia at the entrance to the Martha Cook building. Portia is the heroine of Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice, and this is still there. And this next slide shows that the Martha Cook building has held up very well. I don't know whether any of you lived there ever, but it's a beautiful, beautiful building and still used only to house women, and this is how it looks now. It's held up very well. They have done a lot to maintain it, but I'm sure there's more to be done. The university had a grand opening dinner in early November, followed by a public reception at which, for the first time, Cook's role, once secret, was made plain. Before we leave the story of how Cook came to give Michigan the Martha Cook building, I want to tell you about a remarkable building that's now in the Martha Cook building. And this is a picture of it. This is Cook's art case Steinway piano. One of my great research finds was the probate inventory of every single thing Cook owned at his death in his Manhattan townhouse and his country house in Portchester. The book contains a short appendix describing the interior of the townhouse, which I never entered, based on the probate inventory, which described and valued every item. So something very valuable was missing from that probate inventory of Cook's possessions, a custom-made art case Steinway piano delivered to 14 East 71st Street in 1913. The piano is now the centerpiece of the Gold Room in Martha Cook. Cook bequeathed the piano to the dorm in his will, and it was promptly shipped to Ann Arbor on his death before the probate inventory was taken. Cook's piano is a 6-foot grand style A with a custom art case he selected. This piano took a year to build, with 400 people contributing a wide range of artistry. Cook's piano has 42 species of wood from 17 countries and has 12,000 moving parts. The art case has an elaborate inlaid cover decorated with floral curlicues, vines, mermaids, and musical symbols. I won't go into it, but I went to Steinway in New York City to search for other pianos like this to see if anybody else had ever ordered one, and I couldn't find that. So above the keyboard, gold lettering says 1913, that's 1913, and in Latin the phrase, music is medicine to the troubled soul. Now here's the thing, Cook didn't play the piano or any other instrument. I hadn't found any evidence that he had an interest in music, and this presented yet another mystery for me to solve. There were hints that I had heard from family members that Cook had a friendship with an opera singer. There were hints the relationship was serious. The woman regularly gave gifts to Cook's nieces. I had hunted and hunted for an opera singer to no avail. So please excuse a second digression about the solution to this mystery of why the art case piano, because it led me to something I otherwise would never have found out about Cook. So William Cook's elegant townhouse at 14 East 71st Street contained a paneled library with a crystal chandelier, a fireplace, and glass-enclosed bookcases filled with books. In 1929, as Cook committed to building the Legal Research Building, the law library, York and Sawyer suggested creating a space on the 9th floor of legal research to which Cook's library, paneling, fireplace, books, and all could be moved. Since it was unlikely, given his illness, that he would ever live in the townhouse again, Cook agreed. And it's all still there. What you see in this photograph is still on the 9th floor in the Legal Research Building. The exact furniture isn't still there, but the room is used, as far as I know, for meetings and maybe small seminars. Most of the books are wallpaper books, nicely bound, but no signs of use. They're just there as wallpaper. Nobody read them. So I asked my research assistant to inventory the books and look for any that Cook might have marked up, part of my effort to understand the sources and concepts behind his writing. One day, my research assistant came to me with an autographed book, and this is what it was, the Matador, Arnold Bennett's The Matador of the Five Towns. At the time, this was a popular, very popular short story collection. It was signed Isabel Hauser, Hauser, August 15th, 1912, Cleveland. I had never heard of Isabel Hauser, and this was pretty late in my research. I'd found the piano, so the only other autographed books in Cook's library were from people I already knew were close to Cook and important to him, but I had never heard of Isabel Hauser. And the reason I hadn't found her, as this slide shows, is that she wasn't an opera singer, she was a pianist. A pianist. A pianist. So maybe they had a connection. I learned that she was a pianist, not an opera singer, and that she was from Cadiz, Ohio, which isn't that far from Cleveland, and she lived across Central Park in the relatively new and swanky Apthorpe apartments, which are now condos. They take up the entire block between West 78th and 79th Streets and Broadway and West End Avenue. And this shows the interior courtyard, a much more recent photo, of course, than back then, but it was quite a wonderful place. And Hauser lived there with her maid. This is a current view of what the Apthorpe looks like. It's now condos. Perhaps the relationship with Hauser influenced Cook in his mid-50s to build the townhouse and include the art case piano. The sad ending to this is that Isabel died suddenly and painfully in December 1915, mere weeks after the Martha Cook Building opened. Her will revealed that she owned many of the same stocks and bonds as Cook. And the story of how she died is truly gruesome, and I don't go into it. So again, I've strayed from my story about the will contest. Let's resume. Who was Ida Olmsted Cook, who threatened in 1939 to sue for half of Cook's estate? She was the daughter of Dwight Olmsted, a very important lawyer in New York City who bought and sold land as the Manhattan population moved north, and who single-handedly reformed New York City's land registration system, which was critical to being able to transfer property, land registration system. Ida was also the niece of Theodore Dwight, another stellar figure in late 19th century legal education. He was the founding dean of both Columbia Law School and the New York Law School. Ida, as you can see here, was beautiful, a petite woman with a tiny waist and delicate features, blue eyes, curly light brown hair heaped on her head. Will and Ida married on February 20th, 1889. I know from their correspondence that he was desperately eager to marry her, and she was desperately anxious about marriage and reluctant to become his wife because her parents' marriage was not a success, and that's putting it mildly. However, his promise to make her the brightest, sweetest, happiest wife that ever lived persuaded her. However, the marriage was not happy. They separated several times and in 1898 were divorced. A chronology of his work for Mackey and his publications shows him to have been a workaholic who couldn't possibly have spared much time for Ida. In 1898, and I'm sorry you can't see this better, I almost brought the book, but it's just as difficult to see in the book. Headline, Divorced in One Dakota Day. In 1898, Ida took a train through a blizzard from Manhattan to Wapaton, North Dakota, and filed for divorce. Why North Dakota? Because for a brief time in the late 1890s, it was the divorce capital of the US. A New York paper ran a large cartoon in 1898, and you see it here, Divorced in a North Dakota Day, showing a Rube Goldberg-like divorce machine. While New York's laws discouraged divorce, North Dakota laws offered everything needed for a quickie divorce. Ida claimed Cook had deserted her in February 1894. Cook's response? No, she deserted me a month before that. He cross-claimed, and the court quickly granted a divorce to Mr. Cook. There was no alimony, no property, no children. Cook's behavior was not gentlemanly by the standards of the day, which called for the husband to take the blame for a failed marriage. Now, skipping ahead to 1931, Ida's lawyer claimed that North Dakota court had not had jurisdiction over her 33 years earlier because her domicile was not where she was, it was where her husband was, which was New York. So she couldn't go to North Dakota and have the North Dakota court have jurisdiction over her. Without that jurisdiction, the lawyer argued the divorce was invalid, making her a widow rather than a divorcee. That's not the law now, but it arguably might have been back in 1898. A New York statute would require that she, a widow, would get half of Cook's estate in 1931. Michigan took the claim seriously, hiring a law firm called Davis, Polk, and Wardwell, Michigan grads, to defend its position should Ida file suit. Ida's lawsuit had caught the university at a really difficult time. First, Cook's estate was primarily stocks and bonds. No one knew in 1931 where the Depression would lead, but the university was scared. Second, the Legal Research Building, the John Cook Dorm, and Hutchins Hall were all under construction. With Cook dead, no longer writing checks, the project might have to halt pending resolution of Ida's claim. Before we learn the outcome of the suit, let's return to the 1920s and understand the university's situation. The fear that Cook might not give everything to Michigan was rational, based on Cook's soured relationship with Dean Bates. After Cook died, Bates would claim credit for the Cook gift, but I'm certain that President Harry Hutchins is the true hero of the story for his role with Cook when Hutchins was first dean of the law school, then president of the university, and later as president emeritus. He stayed in close touch with Cook. Hutchins had spent the 7 years after Martha Cook Building opened in 1915 persuading Cook to give a dorm for law students. Cook did not agree to that until 1922. Hutchins truly knew how to appeal to Cook. Now let's learn about the battle between Dean Bates and William Cook. They did not get along. Bates and Cook held each other in mutual high regard for their professional accomplishments, and each expressed that to other people, but each also expressed negative opinions about the other. Bates felt that Cook was peculiar, even savage. Cook said that Bates had, quote, certain personal peculiarities which precluded him from being a good administrator, unquote. Regent Walter Sawyer, trying to ease the tension, wrote to each man to urge patience with the childishness of the other. Regent Sawyer, who you see here, was a U of M regent for a long time. He was 3 years younger than Cook and long a leading citizen of Hillsdale. He was another key person in the story of Cook's gift. His U of M degree was in homeopathy, and he practiced in Hillsdale his whole life. He served as a U of M regent from 1905 until 1931 when he died, the entire period of the Cook gift saga. Sawyer would make the Cook's house his last stop as he did his rounds in town so he could partake of a refreshing beverage. His knowledge of the Cook family psychology helped the university navigate around Cook's prickly, quirky personality. And his knowledge of Bates helped too, as illustrated by the pair of Be Patient with Childishness letters shows. Both Bates and Cook wanted the law school to have better students, better faculty, and to produce more research to improve the law. But unfortunately, they just could not get along. Today, we would label their problem a control issue. To see how it plays out, consider the timeline. During the 7 years from 1924, when the Lawyers Club opened, until 1931, when the John Cook Dorm and Legal Research opened, law students occupied gracious new dorm rooms and ate in the elegant dining room shown here in the Lawyers Club. But that whole time, the rest of the school made do with classrooms, faculty offices, and a library in the old 1863 law building near the corner of North U and State. See the contrast in this and the next slides. This is the Lawyers Club dining room as it appeared in the 1940s. And this is the Lawyers Club dining room much more recently. It looks great, and it has always been that great. And this is where law students ate. And this is the lounge in the Lawyers Club. This photo was taken about 1925, which along with the rest of the Lawyers Club opened in 1924. It's still much the same except for having new furniture. It's used for many events, from formal talks to retirement dinners to just a place to read. And you can see how elegant it is. It has a fireplace, it has large windows. It's just very, very well furnished. In contrast, here students, even those who lived in the Lawyers Club, and faculty were still working, studying, and attending class in the old law building and would for another 7 years. And as you can see, it's not really that nice by today's standards anyway. Cook's donor status was not revealed until the Lawyers Club opened in 1924, and it was a big deal. It made the front page of the New York Times, as you can see on this slide. And this is when Cook's donor status was revealed. From 1922, when Cook committed to build the Lawyers Club, until early 1929, the university was never certain that Cook would give anything more than the Lawyers Club. During that time, that was just the Lawyers Club. It wasn't any dorms. It was just that part that's right along State Street. The university was never certain that Cook would give anything more. During that time, Bates became more and more anxious. As his anxiety built, his behavior worsened. For example, he maneuvered to get 2 offers from Harvard Law. He knew very well Dean Roscoe Pound there, trying to use those job offers to get the regents to push Cook. They refused. This brings us up to an important point. Cook resisted all efforts to name anything he paid for after him. or even just the Cook name alone. He only wanted his parents' names, Martha Cook on that dorm and John Cook on the dorm, the part of the Law Quad dorm that's across Tappan from Martha Cook. And nothing was named after Cook himself until after he died. He didn't want that done. This slide shows those three big gaps between Cook's gift. The first is 1916 to 22 gap between Martha Cook opening and Cook's agreement to build the Lawyers Club, then from 23 to 29 when Cook refused to commit to more. The final gap resulted from Cook's death in 1930 and Ida's threat to sue for her half. What prevented Cook from giving more immediately? Cook and Dean Bates did not agree on anything about the projects. Cook wanted elegant, high-quality buildings and was willing to pay what that would cost. Bates wanted buildings ASAP, which led to his desire for simple brick buildings. Bates wanted Cook to supply the money and then step back. Cook refused. Cook also believed the dorms would turn a handsome profit to support the research Cook wanted the school to carry out. When that didn't happen, Cook blamed Bates. Cook and Bates also disagreed about the size of the law school, which has always been one of the nation's largest with at least 1,000 students. Cook wanted it half that size at 500. Bates wanted to double it to 2,000 to make it more influential. Another problem was that Bates did not understand how to influence Cook. Harry Hutchins was now president of the U of M and advised Bates that Cook's idea of sound exposition in letters is 2/3 of a page. But when Cook asked Bates why the Lawyers Club made no profit, Bates wrote what Cook called 14 pages of explanation that did not explain. So they really did not spend any time talking to each other after the mid-1920s. The fifth and final problem was that Cook relied heavily on a 1910 Michigan law grad, shown here, John Creighton, who wormed his way into Cook's life and was named trustee of Cook's estate. Bates disliked and mistrusted Creighton, calling him a toad who is smoother than all of us and not in this for his health. And my book has a lot more about John Creighton, who did play a huge role in complicating everything after Cook died. So when the Lawyers Club was done in 1924, Cook refused to divulge whether or when he would pay for anything else. This drove Bates nuts. Cook often quoted Emerson, quote, "A man of the world performs much and promiseth nothing." And Cook wrote to then President Burton, quote, "In regard to the dean's reference to the law school building, I was not aware that anyone had promised to erect such a building," end quote. Cook so disliked Bates that in May 1925, Cook announced that he would no longer tolerate any communication with Bates of any kind, May 1925. So the years 1925, 1926, 1927, and most of 1928 passed slowly and painfully by. The main reason for Cook's inaction was probably the terrible relationship with Bates, but there was a second reason. Cook was sick with TB since 1920 and may not have felt up to the role he played in designing the buildings. And a third reason is that Cook was writing that book I showed you to at the very beginning, American Institutions and Their Preservation, which came out in 1927. Cook did a second edition in 2 volumes in 1929. He was working on a third edition when he died. This book is certainly the source of the idea that he was prejudiced, and I'm going to talk about that near the end. In 1927, Bates again used his long friendship with Harvard's Dean Roscoe Pound to solicit yet another offer from Harvard. This was the third or the fourth. The relatively new U of M president, Clarence Cook Little, shown here, took the bait from Bates, and became terribly worried that Bates would decamp to Harvard. But the regents were unperturbed. They were used to Bates and his threats to leave. The regents told Little, "This is just the first time he's threatened to leave during your presidency. Bates is not serious." Bates realized he might be able to take advantage of President Little, who shared Bates' trait of impatience and his tendency to take ill-conceived actions. In late 1928, Bates persuaded Little that between the Michigan legislature and Bates' private fundraising skills, and be aware there was no evidence to support either assumption, money could be raised for the law school buildings. Bates persuaded Little to recommend that the Regents pursue the money elsewhere and inform Cook they were doing so, and that the Regents tell Cook that if he wanted to give, that would be nice, but they weren't going to wait any longer for Cook's money. The Regents held a secret meeting in December 1928. Afterward, they told Little his idea was terrible and they had lost all trust in him. Little's subsequent letter of resignation cites as his first reason for leaving his, quote, inability to deal with private donors in a manner consistent with policies the Regents deemed wise. Little resigned effective June 1929. Then, was it a miracle or a mere coincidence? Hutchins appeared at the January 1929, just a few weeks later, Regents meeting with a letter from Cook affirming his commitment to build the Legal Research Building. Later that year, Cook also committed to build the John Cook Dorm and last Hutchins Hall. The law building that Bates had wanted to come first was actually last. Now we see the 1931 lawsuit from Ida in context and better understand the anxiety in Ann Arbor. 3 buildings were under construction. The value of the estate was dropping as the Depression worsened. But even worse, in 1931, lawyer William Gibbs McAdoo contacted the university about his client. And here is McAdoo, who became a U.S. Senator and from California. He had served as Treasury Secretary in Woodrow Wilson's cabinet. His client claimed to be Cook's widow. She threatened to sue to claim half of Cook's estate. Were she to win, the university would be unable to complete the buildings that had just been started in 1929 and 30. At first, the university wasn't concerned. They had found divorce papers in Cook's safe and thought that would be proof enough. But the Regents became concerned when the highly regarded and well-connected McAdoo came on the scene. So the university wanted to negotiate. But Ida was in California, and the university was at a huge disadvantage because they knew nothing about her circumstances. Was she hale and hearty and of sufficient means to endure a long and expensive lawsuit, or was she old, weak, and poor, willing to settle for relatively little? No one knew. Her lawyer, McAdoo, was in California, but not likely to disclose that information to the university until ordered to by a court, and no suit had been filed yet. Help. Why is that not? Okay, let me try something else. There. No one, at any rate, knew Ida's circumstances until Myrtle White. Remember her? There she is again. Who we recall was U of M's first contact with Cook back in 1911. Lower right in this photo. Step back into the picture. She was living near LA with her husband, a successful physician, but as a loyal alum, often returned to Ann Arbor. In late 1931, she visited again and met with several university officials who told her about the dire situation with the Cook estate. They gave her Ida's LA address and asked her to see what she could learn. She quickly did just that. Myrtle wrote back to University Secretary Shirley Smith in mid-December 1931 that she had a friend who taught at UCLA, Margaret Carhart, who annually arranged a trip to England for her students. One of those students was Beatrice Borst, who wanted to go but could not afford the trip. Miss Borst, however, told Professor Carhart that she hoped her aunt, who lived with her, might come into an inheritance to pay for the trip. The aunt was, of course, Mrs. Ida Cook. What a coincidence. Myrtle asked Carhart to get more information from Beatrice about her aunt, Ida, and Carhart did. The result of Myrtle's search, the university learned that Ida was indeed poor and in bad health and settled with her a few weeks later for $160,000. And what became of Ida? Amazingly, she moved to Ann Arbor in the late 1930s and died in St. Joe's Hospital in 1942, the year I was born. She lived for a couple of years in the Union, near the completed quad, where she could pass by it daily. Later, she lived with niece Beatrice Borst, who earned an MA in English and won the Hopwood Award in 1941 for her semi-autobiographical novel. I learned about Ida from her relative Larry McGill. Larry lived with Ida and Beatrice for at least one summer in the Ann Beret apartments shown here on East University, where that super tall first Zaragon is now. He told me that Ida was quite a character and would wander the streets of Ann Arbor offering to tell people all about William W. Cook's sex life. I immediately wanted to know, what did she have to say? What a disappointment when Larry said, gosh, I don't know, I was only 8 years old. So I'll never know. So do you recall Cook's eagerness to marry and Ida's reluctance? Ironically, for the rest of her life, Ida called herself Mrs. William W. Cook, even on her gravestone in Manhattan's prestigious Greenwood Cemetery. Her death certificate states that she is Mrs. William W. Cook, but Cook, when asked, as in the census or for a social directory, never described himself as divorced. He always chose the word single. So Cook never saw the buildings on the University of Michigan campus that he had poured his heart, soul, and fortune into. Two were named for his parents, the Martha Cook Building and the John Cook Building, across Tappan from each other. Although he regularly visited Hillsdale, he never returned to Ann Arbor after he graduated from law school in 1882. He told Regent Sawyer that he didn't want to ruin his dream. He told others he didn't want to be pestered by people asking him for more money. That would be Bates, right? And of course, when he died, only the Lawyers Club had been completed, so he never could have seen it all. He insisted on the highest quality design and materials for his law quadrangle, and he controlled every detail of the construction. For example, he wrote or selected each of the inscriptions over the arches in the dining room and on legal research. He made many other critical decisions himself. He chose the type of stone, the elevations of legal research, and the size of its windows and towers. To use his word, he flogged York and Sawyer to do their best work. He had great ambitions for these buildings, which he referred to as York and Sawyer's masterpiece, and for the law school. And yet Cook was modest about himself, never coming here to be thanked, turning down honorary degrees several times, refusing to have buildings named after him. That was done after his death, and to keep his name from the public for years. He was not nearly so rich as the Mackeys who employed him, not nearly so rich as the men who gave money to Duke, the University of Chicago, Carnegie Mellon, or other private universities, but he single-handedly lifted Michigan law from its place as a great state-funded school to a new level as a world-class law school with an international influence and a substantial endowment. Many others, of course, Harry Hutchins, Henry Bates, and their successors as dean, as well as dozens of outstanding faculty and thousands of graduates, deserve credit for what the law school is today. But Cook truly laid the foundation of architecturally splendid buildings and a foundation of a rich resource endowment. I return to 2 points I made at the beginning: his motives for giving everything to Michigan and his role in fostering U of M's support from alumni. He expressed his motives in his will. First, he believed that, quote, American institutions are of more consequence than the wealth or power of the country, that the legal profession could preserve and develop those institutions, and that by improving the Michigan Law School, he would improve the character of the legal profession and help to preserve American institutions. That's first. Second, Cook wanted his gift to, quote, cause others to realize that the university, this is really important, can no longer be extended in its main developments by state taxation alone, and that others, quote, should be generous in their financial support. That university is and should be the pride of the state of Michigan. Now let's turn to Cook's last book, which I mentioned at the start. This is the book. A faculty colleague asked me, when I first was talking about what became this book, why did he write the book? I was embarrassed not to know the answer, but now I do. I then recalled that my first question in 1973 about Cook was, why did he give so much to U of M law? And it turns out the answer to both questions is the same. And the answer is right here. It's hard to read this. This is Jim Duderstadt's photo of the section of Cook's will that's on the wall between the two doors that go out to the law quad. You can see this there. He wanted American institutions preserved because they are of more consequence than the wealth or power of the country, and because he believed that well-educated lawyers were essential to preserving those institutions, hence his gift to his own law school. I'm going to do this part pretty quickly. These are Cook's 10 American institutions. I'm not going to read them all. I'm just going to point out that a brief summary of the book will make clear its lack of originality and its failure to make any impact at all, except perhaps for any negative impact on Cook's long-term reputation at the University of Michigan. So I'm going to try to combat that idea. This is the slide showing part one of the book, a list of the 10 American institutions, recognizable to all of us, although stated in older language. And then it's similar to de Tocqueville's list in Democracy in America. They're similar, they're not identical. The problem with Cook's book lies in part two, which describes the traits of 15 groups of people and their relationship to American institution. Herein lies the trouble. Cook felt that diverse groups had already been successfully fused or amalgamated, to use his words, into America. Cook assigned a set of traits to each race, citing an astonishingly wide variety of sources to support, or perhaps to create, his opinions. Then he judged the likelihood of a race amalgamating and what would happen to it if it did not amalgamate. For each race, he lists positive and negative characteristics and statistics from historical works and the census. I'm not going into what he wrote about each group. It would be a whole separate talk, but here's the start of his 12 pages about the Irish. And I'm Irish Leary, okay? A singularly affectionate race when treated with kindness and firmness, yet quick to take offense and quarrelsome. They wait for no oncomer. They are their own worst enemies. Now, I want to make some observations about the context in which Cook wrote this book to illustrate that he was not alone in many of his opinions. I recently learned a lot about the 1920 census. Remember, Cook wrote the first edition of this book in 1923, shortly after the results of that census became known. Those results so alarmed Congress and probably many Americans that Congress never either reapportioned Congress nor allowed the states to redraw their election districts, even though both are required by Article 1 of the Constitution. This slide shows the results, what would have happened if they had. Rural areas had lost 5 million people. Urban areas had gained 19 million. The southern states had perfected the repression of African American votes. 12 states would have lost power in Congress, and power would have shifted to the Northeast away from the Midwest and the South, and Republican control would have shifted to the Northeast away from the Midwest, and Republican control would have been threatened. Further, the census showed the country of origin of citizens. What happened besides the cancellation of reapportionment and redistricting? The first two national laws limiting immigration and ranking nations from which people could emigrate to the U.S., putting the most like England at the very top and those with ever darker skin lower and lower and lower. I mean, think about it. We never reapportioned Congress. We never redrew election districts in 1920 because of what that census showed. And I couldn't help thinking about 2020 census, which there was somebody who was really trying to stop that from being effective. At any rate, this is, I think, the reason I'm saying all this is to say that what Cook wrote in the 1920s reflected what most Americans felt after they had seen that census. I'm not excusing it, but I'm just saying that's the reason, in my opinion. So the impact of his book, American Institutions, he got about 100 letters after the first edition, and believe me, the Regents encouraged people, graduates they knew, to write to Cook and tell him how wonderful the book was. One exception stands out. Harry Bidka, a proud Polish lawyer in South Bend, Indiana, wrote a 5-page letter to Cook that begins with this: "You have written a number of good books on legal subjects, but your new field seems to be akin to the writing of philosophy by a coal man. We can hope that Mr. Bidka lived to see that American institutions had no discernible impact on anything or anyone." The redeeming qualities of it, however, are on this slide. It does reflect his wide reading and research, and it also reflects the feelings and opinions that many, many people had at the time, as illustrated by the fact that Congress, after they saw the results of the 1920 census, passed the first laws limiting who could come here in a hierarchy that I mentioned. It's kind of an interesting compendium of sources of ideas. Cook achieved his goals. He got the gorgeous law quadrangle and a women's dormitory. He had buildings named after his parents across Tappan from each other. Money, he encouraged money to come to the University of Michigan to support research and to provide an excellent education for new lawyers. He achieved these goals, but unfortunately did not live to enjoy knowing that he had. And now I would love to hear your questions or your comments or your suggestions or anything else. Please. Thank you. Oh, wait, do we have a question?
I have a question. I'd just like to follow up
Sure.
on how you ended your talk. So, as you said, Cook today has sort of a controversial reputation because primarily of that book, but not only because of his views, but also claims that he, as part of his micromanaging of the law quad, he ordered U of M to exclude Jewish students and other quote-unquote undesirables. Can you speak to that?
Sure. Did you all hear the question? To my knowledge, Cook never did anything to discourage or to say that Jews could not live in the buildings that he paid for, that is the dormitories and the lawyers club, nor did he discourage them from being admitted to the law school. I haven't mentioned very much about a man named Creighton, who worked for the bank, the National Bank in New York, and glommed on to Cook and became an advisor to Cook. And as Cook got sicker and sicker in the 1920s, and then especially after Cook died, Creighton played a greater role as Cook weakened. And after he died, Creighton had a role in administering the estate. And I haven't found in all of my research any solid evidence that Cook himself felt that way about Jews. I found evidence that Creighton did. And Creighton was a truly negative force in this whole story, I guess is the kindest way I can say it. If you look at the book, you can find out a lot more about him. I can't go into it, but he wormed his way into Cook's life during Cook's illness, the last 10 years of his life. He worked for the National Bank, and he became a man who came to the university and said that he was representing Cook's opinions about things. And there is clear evidence that he didn't like Jews, but I never could really find that came from Cook rather than from Creighton himself. And if you look in the book, and I can't go into it here now, but Creighton had a very I don't know how to say it. Creighton was involved with a lot of things that today would seem to not be good, that would be terrible. But I don't want to go into it because you can read the book. Anything else,
I
Andrew?
think we'll open it up to the audience now.
Okay.
Please wait till we bring you a microphone so those who are watching through the live stream can hear you.
Thanks for this. Just to follow up on that question, and to clarify, because there's in the letters between the regents, right? There's a report. The first regents meeting after Little, C.C. Little, becomes president. That his emissary, who I guess Cook's emissary, who I guess is Creighton,
Yes.
comes with a slip of paper with these certain demands. One of which is no Jews should live in the Lacquad. So you're suggesting that that slip of paper about firing the matron who's in charge of the Lawyers Club, and removing the pianos from the parlor, and having no Jews, that comes from Creighton, not Cook?
I don't have any evidence that it came from Cook. And I have evidence that those feelings and beliefs were Creighton's from other things that I found out about Creighton.
The one thing that I thought was interesting in that is how the regents respond to it, right? Which is that they're like, what? Like, what do we need? Of course this is about whether everybody believes similar things at that time, like the level of prejudice, right? They're like, he goes too far.
Yeah.
And the reason I might question whether that was Cook is that they tell Little, you have to go to New York and talk to him and get him out of this position on Jews. And then later also, and again, I guess maybe you're saying it comes from Creighton, where he's trying to exclude both Jews and blacks from the law school. So I just, it's interesting. I mean, it's important information if it wasn't Cook doing that, but I'm wondering if you have evidence that it wasn't Cook.
I'm afraid I have to say it in a weaker way, that I haven't found any evidence that it was Cook, and I have found evidence that Creighton misrepresented many other things, not like that. He misrepresented things about the condition of Cook's finances after Cook died. He did everything he could to become very important in releasing the money to go to help the law school keep building the buildings, but there was no ground for him to really do that. He just didn't have the power to do that. Cook had made it very clear what he had intended for his money to be spent on, and had done that while he was still alive, and there was no reason that I could ever find for Creighton to try to undo that or slow it down. And I also found evidence that Creighton had done other things in his life that didn't have anything to do with Cook.
One more point, again, specifically about Cook, was you showed us the Portia statue.
Yes.
And I believe there's a quote from Cook saying, yeah, she's the one who schooled the Jews, right, in the Merchant of Venice. I mean, that was one of the reasons he admired her.
I didn't see that, and I'm sorry I missed it. And I apologize because I didn't look into what that meant, what Portia meant being there.
Yeah, I'm just, because I think sort of framing, this is a challenge we have about, in those times everybody thought the same thing. And I think we have, for me, C.C. Little, his name is off, the building that had his name on it. Though if you look at what he actually said and did, he kind of pushed against racial prejudice. And so it's interesting, of course, we still have the William Cook, the library, with his name on it.
Quadrangle.
And he's associated with really very fierce attempts at exclusion.
Yep. Oh, no one else?
Thank you for all your work. And I know you didn't come here to talk about this, but this is upsetting me a little. Did the university regents cave to this demand, whether it be Cook's or Creighton's or whatever? Was there a time when blacks and Jews couldn't live in the Lawyers Club?
I am not aware of a time when there was a specific rule like that. blacks weren't living in university dormitories until, and Andrew, you can help me here, until 19.
There were fights to
30-something.
desegregate university dorms in the 1930s.
And
University engaged in a policy of sort of de facto segregation of African American students in university-owned housing.
And I know they couldn't live in fraternities either, so they were forced to.
some of them did live in fraternities because they worked in the fraternity,
But
they weren't members of the fraternity. So, but that's a good question, yeah. Anything else?
well, I have a question.
Yes, another.
So the Law Quad was constructed in a time of sort of this great burst of construction around the university. I mean, it's the time when the Burton Memorial Tower, Hill Auditorium, all these buildings around Central Campus, designed mostly by Albert Kahn, were going up. One of the most notable being right across the street from the La Quadrangle, the William Clements Library. Was there any commentary or how did Cook's gift relate to these broader changes? Were they all, both in his own thinking and also in terms of how the university handled things like development or cultivating donors?
That's a good question, and unfortunately, it's not something I really looked into. I paid attention to finding out what had happened between Cook and the Regents and Creighton, and I didn't really compare it to others. I do know a little bit about Cook and Clements, but that's not exactly what you're asking about.
I'd be curious about that, because Clements was 1923, the same time as the...
Right. So Clements grew up in Ann Arbor, and he and Cook went to the University of Michigan at the same time and earned degrees. They were different degrees in the same year. And at one point, and Clements served on the Regents throughout the whole time of this Cook story. And he served until 1933, I think. In 1933 or 2, he was not reelected to the Regents, and so he wasn't on the Regents then. But he was very interested in getting Cook to use some sandstone from. He was from Bay City. Help me, Bay City. And he wanted Cook to use some sandstone from up there, and Cook didn't want to do that. He wanted more durable buildings. I did find a story in the New York Times. There was a huge event in Manhattan, I believe in 1914, a huge event in Manhattan which was for Michigan graduates, because University of Michigan had more members of Congress than any other college or university. And so they had a big event in, I think, the Astor Hotel, and the newspaper reports said that Cook was invited to it and that Clements was also, and that they were seated at the same table. But it was a big table of 12. I don't know if they were sitting next to each other, and I don't even know for sure that they actually were there. They were saying they were assigned to the same table. But they were around at the same time, and at first I didn't think there was any reason they would have been together, but then I found out about this dinner, and then I found out that they'd been in Ann Arbor going to the University of Michigan at the same time, and so they may well have been in touch with each other. Cook never came back to Ann Arbor, and I don't know much about how much Clements went to New York, where he might have seen Cook. I do know that Cook seemed to spend most of his time working. He was in court, or he was researching, or he was doing other lawyer work rather than socializing. But that's all I can really say about Cook and Clements. They existed at the same time and were interested in improving buildings at the University of Michigan.
One more question.
It's an architecture question.
Sure.
And I know you talked about the architects who did this, but like I remember coming here and I was an undergrad at Yale and I saw the law school. I'm like, oh, they copied Yale, but
Oh.
ultimately I realized Yale copied them. And I'm wondering about whether in terms of setting standards for law schools and what things should look like, the role that the law school quad played, not just in Ann Arbor, but sort of nationally, and whether you have any sense of that, like maybe, was York and the architects thinking about Oxford, or was it sort of a new kind of design? What were they basing it on? Did others base on that?
York and Sawyer did go to England and look at the buildings there, and I'm sure that influenced them. I can't really answer the rest of your question, though. There is a wonderful book by Eileen Forsyth, who was teaching in the Department of Art here. She's passed on, but she's written a very good book about what you're asking about, the architecture of the law quad. I didn't really dig into that, but she did a marvelous job. And her book is very, very good at describing the ways in which the Michigan Law Quad did or did not follow which English institutions. Yep.
Well, we're almost out of time, but I am the host, so I'm going to ask one
Okay.
question I want to know.
You get to.
Did Henry Bates ever go to Harvard? Did he ever
No,
go?
he never did. He never did.
It was
He
all
never
just a
did.
bluff.
It was all a bluff. It was all a bluff. And I was able to get some microfilm of the papers of the man at Harvard who he found that he was hoping would make him and I don't know whether he really got offers or whether he said he got offers. So unfortunately, you can't always believe what he said about things like that. I have one other thing to say about Clarence Cook Little. I became very suspicious of him long before most other people did, because I was curious about where he went when he left Michigan. And I looked into it, and I discovered that when he left Michigan, he went to Maine. I think he worked at the University of Maine. And he didn't take his wife with him. He took the babysitter with him. And when I found that out, I thought, he was going to leave anyway, no matter what.
They announced his divorce the day after he resigned.
Yeah. And so it took a while for everybody to realize that about him, but well, you've been a great audience. Thank you so much.
Note,
it's a long time.
Thank you so much,
Yep.
Margaret. Thank all of you for joining us this evening, both those of you in person and on the live stream. Thanks as well to Austin for monitoring the live stream, and to the wonderful Michigan media team for recording all this. It's not possible without you guys. You guys are great. Tonight's session will be available online on YouTube in about a week, and will be shared automatically with all of you who registered, and we're going to keep it up on YouTube until they shut the Bentley down, which hopefully will be never. Our next Making Michigan session will be on March 27th. We will be joined by Tanya Neff Chang, who will be discussing the experience of early African-American medical students here at U of M. Now, for those of you here in the observatory, the original observatory building upstairs is going to be open until 9. We have some really fantastic student docents to share things about it. And I highly encourage you, if you've never had a chance, to go take a look at the 1850s telescopes. They're super cool. I don't know if we're going to be doing any observing through them tonight. The weather's kind of unfortunate. But please come back tonight when it's clearer. Otherwise, have a wonderful night and be safe.